June 13th, 1944, 4:18 a.m., somewhere over the English Channel. The radar operator at RAF Swingate watched his screen with growing alarm as the signature appeared. Not fast enough for a fighter, not the right profile for a bomber, moving at approximately 400 miles per hour in a straight line toward London. The phone to Fighter Command was picked up within seconds. Diver, diver, diver. Bearing 270, altitude 2,000 feet, speed 400. The code word diver had been chosen 3 weeks earlier during planning sessions that assumed this moment might never come. British intelligence had been warning about Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe revenge weapons for over a year. Reconnaissance photographs showed massive concrete structures in northern France. Prisoner interrogations mentioned pilotless aircraft. But until this morning, the threat remained theoretical. At 4:25 a.m., the first V-1 flying bomb crossed the English coast near Gravesend. Witnesses described a small aircraft with stubby wings, trailing flame from its tail, making a sound like a giant motorcycle engine. The pulse jet motor produced a distinctive buzzing roar that would soon become terrifyingly familiar to millions of Londoners. This particular V-1 flew for another 12 minutes before its fuel exhausted, the engine cut out, and the 1-ton warhead plummeted into the suburb of Bethnal Green, destroying a railway bridge and several houses. Within the next 24 hours, 9 more Vones second would impact across southeastern England. Within a week, thousands would follow. By late June 1944, Hitler's newest weapon was striking London at a rate of over 100 per day, killing hundreds of civilians and terrorizing a population that had endured 4 years of conventional bombing. The V-1 represented a new category of threat. Unlike bombers, it required no crew and therefore could not be deterred by casualties. Unlike artillery, it could strike from over 150 miles away. The missile flew too fast for most fighters to intercept and too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns to track effectively. British air defences, which had mastered the art of destroying German bombers during the Blitz of 1940–41, found themselves struggling against an enemy that required no runway, carried no human vulnerability, and came in numbers that overwhelmed conventional defences. The solution to the V-1 threat would come from an American invention so secret that even most military officers didn't know it existed. A device so revolutionary that it would change warfare forever. A technology that German and Japanese military experts had declared theoretically impossible. The proximity fuse, officially designated the VT fuse, for variable time was arguably the most important military innovation of World War II that wasn't connected to nuclear weapons. It transformed anti-aircraft warfare from an art of probability into a science of certainty. And nowhere would its impact be more dramatic than in the skies. Over England during the summer of 1944, when American gunners armed with proximity-fuzed ammunition would achieve destruction rates that even the optimists thought impossible. The impossibility made real. The fundamental problem of anti-aircraft warfare had remained unchanged since World War I. A gun on the ground fires a shell into the air at an aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour, miles away, in 3-dimensional space. The shell travels for several seconds before reaching the aircraft's altitude. During those seconds, the aircraft moves hundreds of yards in an unpredictable direction. The shell must explode at precisely the right moment, not when it's too high, too low, too far ahead, or too far behind, but in the brief instant when it's close enough for fragments to damage the aircraft. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before the proximity fuse, anti-aircraft shells used time fuses. Gunners calculated the approximate time the shell would take to reach the target's altitude, set the fuse accordingly, and hoped the aircraft would be in the right place when the shell exploded. The mathematics required were staggering. Gunners had to account for aircraft speed, altitude, direction, rate of climb or descent, wind speed, air temperature, and dozens of other variables. Even with mechanical computing directors and highly trained crews, time-fused anti-aircraft fire in World War II achieved hit rates of approximately 2,000 to 4,000 rounds, expended per aircraft destroyed. This inefficiency was tolerable when fighting manned bombers flying predictable patterns at steady altitudes. It was catastrophic when fighting V-1 missiles that flew low, fast, and required no time to aim or adjust, since they followed ballistic trajectories after launch. British gunners firing time-fused ammunition at V-1 second during June 1944 achieved destruction rates of approximately 1 missile destroyed per 2,500 rounds fired. At that rate, stopping 100 volts 1 second per day required firing 250,000 rounds, a logistical nightmare that consumed artillery barrels, ammunition, and crew endurance. The proximity fuse solved this problem elegantly. Instead of exploding at a preset time, a proximity-fuzed shell carried a miniature radio transmitter and receiver in its nose. As the shell flew toward its target, the radio transmitted a continuous signal. When the shell came within lethal distance of a large metal object, an aircraft, a missile, anything that reflected radio waves, the reflected signal triggered the fuse, detonating the shell at optimal distance. The aircraft's own presence caused the shell to explode. Gunners no longer needed to predict exactly where the target would be. They only needed to get the shell reasonably close. The concept was simple. The engineering was anything but. Creating a radio transmitter receiver, small enough to fit in a shell nose, rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun at accelerations exceeding 20,000 Gs, reliable enough to function every time, and cheap enough to be expendable, represented engineering challenges that in 1940 seemed insurmountable. German military scientists, when they first captured intelligence about American proximity fuse research, dismissed it as a deception. No radio could survive gunfiring, no battery could power it, no vacuum tube could function under such stress. The whole idea violated basic physics. They were wrong about the physics. They were right that it shouldn't work. But American and British engineers made it work anyway through a combination of brilliant innovation and industrial capacity that Germany couldn't match. Birth of a revolution. The proximity fuse story begins in August 1940 with the Tizard mission. Sir Henry Tizard, a British scientist and rector of Imperial College London, led a small delegation to the United States, carrying what Winston Churchill later called the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. In several metal boxes and secure briefcases, Tizard's team brought technical documentation and physical samples of Britain's most secret military technologies. The delegation included detailed plans for the cavity magnetron, a device that made practical microwave radar possible. They brought the latest jet engine designs. They shared intelligence about German weapons research. And they disclosed everything Britain knew about the theoretical possibility of a radio proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells. Britain needed American industrial capacity. The Battle of Britain was raging. German bombers were attacking England nightly. British scientists had been working on proximity fuse concepts, but lacked the resources to develop them while fighting for national survival. American scientists, not yet at war but increasingly aware that involvement was inevitable, seized on the proximity fuse as their top priority. The National Defense Research Committee, established in June 1940 and later reorganized as the Office of Scientific Research and Development, assigned Section T, the letter T standing for tubes, to develop what they initially called the radio fuse. Merle Tuve, a physicist from the Carnegie Institution of Washington, led the effort. Tuve assembled a team at the newly created Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. They had to solve seemingly impossible problems. First, the power source. Batteries in 1940 were bulky, heavy, and unreliable. A conventional battery large enough to power a radio wouldn't fit in a shell nose and would likely break apart during firing. The team developed a miniature battery using reserve electrolyte technology. The battery was dry during storage and automatically activated by the centrifugal force of gun firing, which forced liquid electrolyte into the cells. Second, the vacuum tubes. Standard radio tubes were glass, fragile, and required careful mounting. The acceleration of gun firing would shatter them instantly. The team developed ruggedized tubes with heavy-duty filaments, shock-mounted elements, and metal-ceramic construction that could withstand launch forces. They tested prototypes by firing them from artillery pieces repeatedly, redesigning anything that broke. Third, the circuit design. The radio had to be simple. Fewer components meant fewer failure points, but sophisticated enough to discriminate between actual targets and false returns from ground, clouds, or rain. The team created a system where the transmitted radio signal was amplitude modulated. The receiver was tuned to detect the Doppler shift of the reflected signal caused by the shell's motion toward the target. This made the fuse sensitive to approaching targets while largely ignoring stationary objects. Fourth, safety mechanisms. A proximity fuse armed itself automatically after firing, but it had to remain inert until clear of friendly aircraft and installations. The team built in multiple safety features. The fuse wouldn't arm until the shell had traveled several hundred yards, giving it time to clear friendly positions. It included a self-destruct mechanism that detonated the shell after a maximum flight time, even if it hadn't detected a target. And it required both centrifugal force from spinning and sustained acceleration from launch before it would activate. By early 1942, the team had working prototypes. The first combat test came in January 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena used proximity-fuzed 5-inch shells against Japanese aircraft attacking Guadalcanal. The results were immediate and spectacular. Helena shot down the first aircraft it engaged and maintained extraordinary success rates throughout the engagement. Where conventional anti-aircraft fire required thousands of rounds per kill, Helena was achieving kills with dozens of rounds. The technology that won the Pacific, the U.S. Navy adopted proximity fuses for shipboard anti-aircraft guns with remarkable speed. By mid-1943, every major American warship carried proximity-fuzed ammunition. The impact on Pacific naval warfare was transformative. Japanese aircraft, which had devastated American forces at Pearl Harbor and in the early Pacific battles, suddenly faced a defense they couldn't penetrate. The statistics tell the story. In 1942, American ships firing time-fuzed anti-aircraft ammunition required an average of approximately 2,500 rounds to destroy one attacking aircraft. In 1943, ships firing proximity-fuzed ammunition required approximately 150 rounds per aircraft, destroyed a 16-fold improvement. By 1944, as gunners gained experience and proximity fuses improved, the figure dropped to around 50 rounds per aircraft. Some engagements achieved even better results. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot American. Ships equipped with proximity-fuzed anti-aircraft ammunition destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft in 2 days with minimal American losses. Japanese pilots, already struggling against superior American aircraft and better-trained pilots, found themselves facing a wall of anti-aircraft fire that was effectively impenetrable. Suicide attacks that might have overwhelmed defenses with time-fuzed ammunition were stopped cold by proximity fuses. The Japanese never understood what hit them. They knew American anti-aircraft fire had become dramatically more effective, but they couldn't determine why. Captured Japanese documents from late in the war show their analysts speculating about new fire control systems, better training, or improved ammunition. They never suspected the truth because they believed miniaturized radar in a shell was impossible. German military intelligence, which shared technical information with Japan, had explicitly told them no such device could exist. This Japanese ignorance was not an accident. Proximity fuse security was extraordinary. The devices were classified at the highest levels higher than radar, higher than code breaking, nearly as secret as the Manhattan Project. Use was strictly controlled. For the first 2 years of production, proximity fuses were authorized only for naval use over water, where unexploded shells would sink and couldn't be recovered by the enemy. The fuses were never used in ground combat in Europe or North Africa before 1944 specifically, because the risk of a dud round falling into German hands was considered too great. Every proximity fuse contained a self-destruct mechanism, but if the mechanism failed, the fuse would represent an intelligence catastrophe. German scientists, given an intact proximity fuse to study, would likely be able to reverse engineer it within months. Hitler's scientists were perfectly capable of building proximity fuses once they understood the design principles. The only reason they hadn't built their own was that they believed it was impossible and therefore never seriously tried. This security regime was tested in late 1943 when an American destroyer fired proximity-fuzed ammunition at German aircraft off the coast of North Africa. Several shells failed to detonate and fell onto land controlled by German forces. American intelligence went into panic mode. Special operations teams were dispatched to recover or destroy the dud shells. German forces recovered at least one proximity fuse, but their analysis was botched. The evaluating scientists concluded the device was an experimental radio altimeter for bombers that had been mistakenly loaded into an anti-aircraft shell. They never understood its true function. This security paranoia would continue even as proximity fuses began to be used against V-1 missiles over England in the summer of 1944. The stakes were simply too high. If Germany reverse-engineered proximity fuses and applied them to their own anti-aircraft defenses, Allied strategic bombing would become prohibitively expensive. If Japan gained the technology, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands would face kamikaze attacks, made far more effective by proximity-fuzed anti-aircraft fire, protecting the suicide aircraft as they approached American ships. By June 1944, American industry was producing proximity fuses at a rate of over 40,000 per day. The device that experts had said was impossible was rolling off assembly lines by the millions. The fuse that Japanese admirals laughed at was about to prove its value in the most dramatic fashion possible, not against aircraft, but against Hitler's vengeance weapons terrorizing London. The V-1 flying bombs that began hitting England in June 1944 represented the perfect target for proximity fuses. Unlike manned aircraft, V-2 flew predictable straight paths at constant altitude. They couldn't take evasive action. They couldn't turn away from incoming fire. They were essentially flying straight toward the guns that would destroy them. All that was needed was to put explosive shells in their path and let the proximity fuses do the rest. The British anti-aircraft forces defending London were about to receive their most powerful weapon. The weapon's full potential would be demonstrated in a single 24-hour period that would change the course of the V-1 campaign and save thousands of British lives. But first, London would endure weeks of terror as the flying bombs rained down, and British defences struggled to stop them with conventional methods. The summer of 1944 would test British resolve once more, just as the Battle of Britain had 4 years earlier. This time, however, British civilians would be saved not by the courage of fighter pilots alone, but by the scientific genius of engineers who had created a weapon that seemed to come from science fiction. June 15, 1944, 11:37 p.m. Somewhere over Kent Flight, Lieutenant Roland Beaumont of the RAF pushed his Hawker Tempest V to maximum speed, the Napier Sabre engine screaming as he closed on the flying bomb ahead. The V-1 was visible in the darkness, a cross-shaped silhouette trailing a bright orange flame from its pulse jet engine. His airspeed indicator showed 380 miles per hour and climbing. The V-1 was pulling away. Beaumont had been one of the first pilots to intercept a V-1 successfully, but success required tactics the RAF had never trained for. The missiles flew at speeds that only the newest British fighters could match. Standard interception procedures didn't work. The V-1 had no pilot to intimidate, no crew to panic, no reason to deviate from its course. It simply flew straight toward London until its fuel ran out and the warhead fell. RAF pilots developed 3 methods for destroying V-2. The safest was to approach from behind and slightly above, diving to gain speed, then opening fire from 300 yards with cannon and machine guns. If the ammunition struck the V-1's warhead, the missile exploded instantly, often close enough to damage or destroy the attacking fighter. Many pilots died learning that lesson. The second method, more dangerous but more reliable, was to fly alongside the V-1 and use the fighter's wingtip to flip the flying bomb's wing, destabilizing it and sending it crashing into the ground prematurely. This required extraordinary flying skill and nerves of steel. Any miscalculation meant collision. The third method, employed by only the most skilled pilots with the fastest aircraft, was to get ahead of the V-1 and shoot it head-on. This approach allowed the pilot to break away before the explosion, but it required speeds that most British fighters couldn't achieve. Beaumont's Tempest was one of the few aircraft fast enough. He pulled ahead of the V-1, banked hard to position himself in its path, and at 200 yards opened fire with his 4 20mm cannons. The flying bomb disintegrated in a massive fireball. Beaumont flew through the expanding debris cloud, his aircraft buffeted by the shockwave. He had just saved hundreds of lives. The V-1 he destroyed had been aimed at central London, where its 1-ton warhead would have destroyed buildings and killed dozens of civilians. But there were 9 more V-2 in the air over England at that moment, and RAF Fighter Command had only a limited number of aircraft fast enough to intercept them. The mathematics were grim. Germany was launching over 100 volts 1 second per day. RAF fighters were destroying perhaps 40%. Anti-aircraft guns were stopping another 20%. The remaining 40%, more than 40 flying bombs every single day, were reaching London and its suburbs. The first weeks of terror. Between June 13th and June 30th, 1944, Germany launched 2,452 volts 1 flying bombs at England. Of these, 2,340 crossed the English coast. British defences destroyed 924, approximately 40%. The remaining 1,416 volts 1 second reached their target areas, mostly London and its immediate suburbs. Each V-1 carried an 850-kilogram Amatol warhead, 1,870 pounds of high explosive, designed to create maximum blast damage to buildings and infrastructure. The explosive force was roughly equivalent to 1,000 kilograms of TNT, making each V-1 impact comparable to a large conventional bomb strike. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which came at predictable times with air raid warnings allowing civilians to seek shelter, V-2 arrived at any hour without warning. The only indication was the distinctive buzzing sound of the pulse jet engine, a sound Londoners quickly learned to fear. As long as the buzzing continued, the V-1 was still flying. When the engine cut out, civilians had approximately 10 seconds before impact. Those 10 seconds became the most terrifying sound imaginable, the sudden silence that meant death was falling. V-1 impacts followed a predictable pattern dictated by the missile's limited accuracy. The Fusilier 103. The V-1's official German designation used a simple autopilot system consisting of a magnetic compass for direction, an aneroid barometer for altitude control, and a small propeller-driven counter that measured distance traveled. When the counter reached the preset value corresponding to the distance from launch site to target, it triggered a mechanism that locked the elevator controls, sending the V-1 into a steep dive. This system was mechanically simple and reasonably reliable, but it was not precise. Wind drift, variations in engine performance, and minor guidance errors meant V-2 aimed at central London might impact anywhere within a circle approximately 15 miles in diameter. Some overshot and landed in the countryside beyond London. Others fell short, hitting suburbs and small towns. The randomness made the attacks more psychologically devastating. No neighbourhood felt safe. The death toll mounted daily. On June 18th, a V-1 struck the Guards' Chapel at Faceless, Wellington Barracks during Sunday morning service, killing 121 people, including many senior military officers. On June 30th, another struck Aldwych, destroying multiple buildings and killing 48. By the end of June 1944, V-1 strikes had killed over 1,600 British civilians and seriously injured over 4,500 more. The attacks were disrupting London's recovery from years of conventional bombing and threatening to undermine British morale, just as Allied forces were fighting their way through Normandy following D-Day. The British government faced difficult choices. Publicly acknowledging the full extent of V-1 damage might harm morale and give German intelligence valuable targeting information. But hiding the truth was impossible. Thousands of Londoners saw and heard the explosions daily. The Ministry of Information settled on a middle approach, acknowledged the attacks, but described them as largely ineffective. Newspapers carried stories of V-2 destroyed by fighters and anti-aircraft guns, emphasizing defensive successes while downplaying civilian casualties. The press called them doodlebugs or buzz bombs, using informal names that made the weapons sound less threatening. Behind this public confidence, military planners worked frantically to improve defenses. The challenge was unprecedented. The V-1 flew faster than most fighters, and too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns optimized for high-altitude bombers. It was too small to provide a good radar target, and too cheap for Germany to care about losses. Unlike bombers, which Germany couldn't afford to lose by the hundreds, V-2 could be manufactured rapidly in underground factories and launched from simple ramps that were difficult to locate and destroy. The Defence in-Depth Strategy Air Marshal Roderick Hill, commanding RAF Air Defence of Great Britain, organised a layered defence designed to maximise V-1 destruction. The first layer consisted of fighter patrols over the English Channel and the coast. Fast fighters, primarily Hawker Tempests, Supermarine Spitfire XIVs, and North American P-51 Mustangs patrolled specific zones, attempting to intercept V-2 before they reached land. This layer destroyed approximately 30 to 40% of V-2 on good days when weather permitted effective fighter operations. The second layer was a belt of anti-aircraft guns positioned along the coast from Dover to Beachy Head. Initially, these guns were a mix of calibers, including 3.7-inch heavy guns, 40mm Bofors light guns, and even lighter weapons. The gunners faced enormous challenges. V-2 flew at altitudes between 2,000 and 4,000 feet, too low for heavy guns with large minimum ranges, but too high for optimal use of light weapons. The missile's 400 miles per hour speed meant gunners had only seconds to acquire, track, and fire at each target. Worse, fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns interfered with each other. Fighters pursuing V-2 over the gun belt were endangered by anti-aircraft fire. Gunners had to hold fire when friendly aircraft were near the target, giving V-2 free passage during those critical moments. The coordination problems were nightmarish. Despite intensive training and strict procedures, several British fighters were shot down by British anti-aircraft fire during V-1 operations. The third defensive layer consisted of balloon barrage cables strung across the approach paths to London. Over 2,000 barrage balloons were positioned in a defensive screen, each balloon trailing multiple steel cables intended to snag low-flying aircraft and missiles. V-2 that struck the cables usually exploded or crashed. The balloon barrage destroyed several hundred V-2 during the campaign, but it had significant drawbacks. The balloons restricted friendly air operations, interfered with commercial aviation, and could be effective only in relatively calm weather. Strong winds forced the balloons down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. This three-layer system destroyed approximately 40 to 45% of V-2, attempting to reach London during June 1944. It was inadequate. More than half of all launches were getting through, and Germany showed no signs of reducing launch rates. British intelligence estimated German production capacity at 150 to 200 volts 1 second per day, with potential to increase further. If launch rates increased to match production capacity, London might face 100 or more impacts per day, a casualty rate that would be politically and psychologically unsustainable. The solution lay in American warehouses and aboard cargo ships crossing the Atlantic. Proximity fuses and the 90mm anti-aircraft guns that would fire them. British requests for proximity-fuzed ammunition had been approved in April 1944, but the weapons were only beginning to arrive in quantity. American security concerns meant the fuses couldn't be issued until firing positions were prepared in locations where dud rounds would not fall into areas accessible to German agents or commandos. The weapons couldn't be used anywhere German forces might recover an intact fuse. The Great Redeployment. On June 17, 1944, General Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, made a radical decision. He would reorganize the entire anti-aircraft defense of London, moving hundreds of guns from their current positions to new sites along the coast. The redeployment was a massive undertaking involving thousands of troops, hundreds of artillery pieces, millions of rounds of ammunition, and all the associated infrastructure, fire control, radar, searchlights, communications equipment, power generators, and living quarters for the gun crews. The plan called for creating a solid belt of anti-aircraft guns along the coast, positioned where they could engage V-2 over water before the missiles reached land. This would eliminate the coordination problems with fighter. Aircraft fighters would operate on one side of the gun belt, guns would operate on the other, with clear boundaries between them. It would also mean any dud rounds or damaged V-2 would fall into the sea rather than onto populated areas, making proximity-fuzed use possible. The new gun line would extend from Street Margaret's Bay near Dover westward to Beachy Head, a distance of approximately 50 miles. General Pyle allocated 192 heavy anti-aircraft guns to this belt, mostly 3.7-inch British weapons and 90mm American guns. Behind this heavy gun line, he positioned 524 Bofors 40mm guns, providing additional firepower against any V-2 that penetrated the first belt. The entire system would be tied together with fire control radar, allowing multiple guns to engage the same target simultaneously under radar direction. The redeployment began immediately and proceeded with impressive speed. Gun crews worked around the clock to dismantle weapons at their old positions, move them to the coast, and establish new firing positions. Within 2 weeks, the entire anti-aircraft defense of London had been reorganized. Fighter aircraft were restricted to operations over the Channel and over areas beyond the gun belt. The coastal gun belt became exclusively an anti-aircraft zone, where guns would fire without restriction at any target detected by radar. At the same time, American supply ships were unloading proximity-fuzed ammunition at British ports. The ammunition came in 2 types. The first was standard 90mm anti-aircraft shells fitted with T-97 proximity fuses, the same ammunition American ships had been using successfully against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. The second was British 3.7-inch shells, fitted with American-supplied fuse components assembled in British factories under license. The ammunition came with strict handling instructions. Proximity fuses were more complex than time fuses and required more careful handling. They had to be kept away from radio transmitters that might trigger them prematurely. They couldn't be exposed to extreme temperatures. They had detailed procedures for testing and loading. Gunners were trained intensively in the new ammunition's characteristics, learning the differences between proximity fuse and time fuse firing procedures. The most important difference was psychological. With time fuses, gunners set the fuse for the expected time to target altitude, fired, and hoped they'd calculated correctly. Success required accurate prediction and more than a little luck. With proximity fuses, gunners simply aimed at the target, fired, and the shells detonated themselves at optimal range. Success required only reasonably accurate aiming, something gun crews trained for constantly. The shift from prediction to direct engagement transformed anti-aircraft gunnery from probability calculation to achievable certainty. The first results. The newly redeployed gun belt became operational on July 9, 1944. Initially, the guns used conventional time-fused ammunition, while crews adjusted to their new positions and refined coordination procedures. The first week showed promising results. The concentration of guns along the coast, combined with improved radar fire control and better coordination, increased the destruction rate from approximately 20% to nearly 30%. It was an improvement, but not a revolutionary one. On July 17th, the first proximity-fuzed ammunition was issued to gun crews. American 90mm guns received T-97 fused shells. British 3.7-inch guns received shells with British-assembled proximity fuses. The ammunition was distributed carefully. Not all guns received proximity ammunition immediately because supplies were still limited. Priority went to the 90mm guns and the most effective 3.7-inch gun positions. The orders were explicit. Gun crews were to fire only at targets over water. Any V-1 that crossed the coastline and was not destroyed was to be left to the fighter aircraft and inland defences. No proximity-fuzed ammunition could be fired where a dud shell might fall on land. The security classification was absolute. Crews were told the ammunition used new fuses, but were given no technical details. The phrase proximity fuse or variable time fuse was never mentioned. Crews were instructed to report any ammunition malfunctions immediately to intelligence officers, who would secure any dud rounds. The first engagement came at 1,423 hours on July 17th, when radar detected a V-1 crossing the French coast. The missile flew straight and level at 2,800 feet altitude and 390 miles per hour. 4 American 90mm guns at a site near Dymchurch received firing coordinates from their fire control radar. At 1,428 hours, with the V-1 approximately 8,000 yards offshore, the guns opened fire. The third salvo detonated directly below the V-1. The missile disintegrated and fell into the sea. Total rounds expended, 12 shells from 4 guns. With time-fused ammunition, destroying a V-1 at that range would have required an average of 200 to 300 rounds and considerable luck. The gun crew's recorded comment was brief. New ammunition very effective. Request more. Over the next 6 hours, the American 90mm batteries engaged 7 more V-1 second. They destroyed 6, using an average of 15 rounds per kill. The one V-1 that survived the engagement had flown through a gap in coverage where no guns had clear lines of fire. It was later destroyed by a Spitfire fighter. By midnight on July 17th, gunners and fire control officers were filing enthusiastic reports. The new ammunition was far more effective than anything they had used before. The only complaint was that not enough guns had proximity-fuzed ammunition yet. Over the next 10 days, as more proximity ammunition arrived and was distributed to additional gun positions, the destruction rate climbed steadily. By July 27th, the coastal gun belt was destroying approximately 50% of V-1 second attempting to cross. This was double the rate achieved with time-fuzed ammunition and equal to the best results Fighter Command had achieved during the entire campaign. And the numbers were improving daily as crews gained experience with the new ammunition. German launch rates during this period remained high over 100 volts, 1 second per day most days, with peaks exceeding 150. But for the first time since the campaign began, British defences were destroying more V-1 second than were getting through. The impact on London was immediate and visible. Civilian casualties dropped. The number of buildings destroyed declined. The terror that had gripped London's population for 6 weeks began to ease. Still, half of all V-1 second were reaching their targets. The death toll continued rising. The new ammunition was better than anything previously available, but it wasn't yet good enough. What was needed was not just improvement, but a dramatic transformation of defense effectiveness. That transformation would come in a single day or more. Precisely, a single 24-hour period that would demonstrate the proximity fuse's full potential and effectively end the V-1 campaign as a strategic threat. The stage was set, the guns were in position, the ammunition was arriving in sufficient quantities, the crews were trained. All that remained was for someone to decide to commit everything, all available proximity, ammunition, all guns, maximum fire, no restrictions against every V-1 that came within range. On August 28, 1944, that order was given. What happened in the next 24 hours would prove that the weapon Japanese admirals had laughed at as impossible was, in fact, the most effective anti-aircraft weapon ever created. August 28, 1944, 2:37 a.m. Gun position Baker 7. Dymchurch Sergeant William Morrison of the 184th Anti-Aircraft Battery had been at his post for 4 hours when the radar warning came through the headphones. Another V-1, approaching from the southeast at 2,400 feet. The crew had been busy all night. This would be the 8th engagement since midnight. Morrison's battery operated 4 American 90mm M1 anti-aircraft guns, and all 4 had been firing almost continuously. The previous 7 engagements had destroyed 5 V-1. The other 2 had been damaged and knocked off course, crashing into the sea short of their targets. Morrison was keeping personal statistics in a small notebook: rounds fired, targets engaged, hits scored. In 4 hours, his battery had fired 127 rounds and destroyed or damaged 7 targets. Before the proximity-fuzed ammunition arrived 5 weeks earlier, his battery would have been fortunate to achieve 1 kill every 3 or 4 days of operations. The fire control radar locked onto the incoming V-1. The mechanical computer calculated the firing solution and transmitted azimuth and elevation data to the guns. The 4 gun crews responded with practiced efficiency. The guns slewed onto target, elevation adjusting to match the V-1's altitude. Morrison, as battery commander, gave the order: battery, load, battery, ready, battery, fire. The 4 guns fired simultaneously, hurling 90mm shells toward the approaching missile at muzzle velocities exceeding 2,700 feet per second. The shells arced upward, each one transmitting its radio signal, searching for the distinctive metal reflection that would indicate proximity to a target. At 4,800 yards from the battery position, 2 shells detected the V-1 simultaneously and detonated. The double explosion tore the missile apart. Flaming debris scattered across the water. The pulse jet engine, separated from the airframe, continued firing for several seconds before plunging into the channel. Total time from radar detection to destruction: 43 seconds. Total rounds expended: 4. Morrison made the notation in his notebook and prepared for the next engagement. He had no way of knowing that his battery's performance that morning was being replicated at gun positions up and down the coast, and that the data being collected would prove to be historically significant. The decision to go maximum. The decision to stage an all-out demonstration of proximity-fuzed effectiveness came from a combination of military necessity and political pressure. By late August 1944, the V-1 campaign had been underway for 11 weeks. German forces had launched over 8,000 flying bombs at England, and approximately 2,300 had reached London and surrounding areas. Civilian casualties exceeded 6,000 dead and 17,000 seriously injured. Property damage was extensive: over 25,000 buildings destroyed and hundreds of thousands damaged. The psychological impact was wearing down British morale. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which had ended in May 1941, the V-1 attacks were continuous and random. They struck at all hours, gave minimal warning, and seemed unstoppable. British civilians, who had endured 4 years of war with remarkable resilience, were beginning to show signs of war weariness. The government faced increasing pressure to demonstrate that defences were effective, that the attacks would not continue indefinitely, and that something was being done. At the same time, military planners recognized that the V-1 campaign would not last much longer, regardless of defensive effectiveness. Allied forces advancing through France were overrunning the launch sites in the Pas-de-Calais region. German forces were evacuating many sites and relocating launchers to the Netherlands and Germany itself, from where London was out of range. Intelligence estimates suggested the V-1 campaign against London would end by mid-September at the latest, as launch sites were captured. The window for demonstrating proximity-fuzed effectiveness was closing. If the campaign ended with V-2 still getting through at significant rates, the perception might be that British defences had never mastered the problem. But if defences could achieve dramatic success in the campaign's final weeks, it would prove both the effectiveness of the defensive measures and the value of the new technology. General Pyle issued orders on August 25th for maximum effort against V-2 on the next day, with optimal weather conditions. All available proximity-fuzed ammunition was to be allocated to the coastal gun belt. All guns were to engage all targets within range without conserving ammunition. Fire control radar operators were to maintain continuous watch. Fighter aircraft were to operate at maximum sortie rates in their designated zones. The entire air defense system would demonstrate its peak capability. August 28, 1944, provided the optimal conditions. Weather was clear, with excellent visibility. Winds were light. The barometric pressure was high and stable conditions that improved radar performance and made V-1 flight paths more predictable. The only variable was German launch rates, but intelligence suggested these would be high. German forces knew that Pas-de-Calais launch sites would soon be overrun by advancing Allied armies, and they were launching as many vones second as possible before withdrawal. 24 hours that changed everything. The 24-hour period from midnight August 27th to midnight August 28th saw Germany launch 101 volts, 1 flying bombs toward London. This was not an unusually high number. Launch rates had exceeded 150 per day at the campaign's peak, but it was sufficient to provide meaningful statistical data. More importantly, weather conditions remained optimal throughout the period, allowing all defensive systems to operate at peak efficiency. Of the 101 volts 1 second launched, 97 crossed the English coast. 4 fell into the Channel due to mechanical failures before reaching the British defensive zone. Of the 97 that crossed the coast, 82 were destroyed by anti-aircraft guns before reaching 5 miles inland. That figure represented 84.5% of all vones second that entered the engagement zone, an unprecedented destruction rate that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. The breakdown of destructions was revealing. Of the 82 volts 1 second destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, 79 were destroyed by guns firing proximity-fuzed ammunition. The remaining 3 were destroyed by guns using time-fuzed ammunition, mostly British 3.7-inch guns that hadn't yet received full allocations of proximity fuses. The proximity-fused guns achieved an average destruction rate requiring only 40 rounds per V-1 destroyed. Some battery positions reported destruction rates requiring fewer than 20 rounds per target. Fighter aircraft operating beyond the gun belt destroyed an additional 11 vones second. The balloon barrage accounted for 2 more. 2 vones second crashed due to mechanical failures after crossing the coast. Only 2 vones second out of 101 launched actually reached London. Both exploded in the suburbs, causing relatively minor damage and no deaths. The statistics represented a revolutionary transformation of anti-aircraft effectiveness. Before, proximity fuses, British defences were destroying approximately 40% of vones second, requiring over 2,000 rounds of ammunition per kill. With proximity fuses, British defences were destroying over 82% of vones second using fewer than 50 rounds per kill. The efficiency improvement exceeded 40-fold. The cost reduction in ammunition expenditure was equally dramatic. More significantly, the psychological impact on British civilians was immediate. For the first time in 11 weeks, London experienced a day with only 2 V-1 impacts. Air raid sirens sounded far less frequently. The terrible waiting for the pulse jet engine to cut out became rare rather than routine. News of the defensive success spread through informal channels. Civilians working in air defense installations told friends and family. Newspapers reported reduced V-1 activity without explaining the reasons, and gradually public confidence began returning. German intelligence noticed the change immediately. They recorded sharply increased loss rates for vones second during late August without understanding the cause. German analysts speculated about improved radar, better fighter tactics, or enhanced British early warning systems. They never suspected the truth. The concept that British guns were using radio-fused ammunition seemed impossible. German scientists had concluded years earlier that such weapons could not exist. This failure of German intelligence represented one of the war's significant blind spots. Germany possessed excellent scientists who were perfectly capable of developing proximity fuses if they had pursued the concept. But German military culture emphasized proven technologies and regarded radical innovations with suspicion. When intelligence reports suggested American ships were using unusual anti-aircraft ammunition in the Pacific, German evaluators dismissed them as exaggerations or deception. The possibility that Americans had solved engineering problems German scientists thought unsolvable never received serious consideration. The technical achievement. The proximity-fuse's success against V-1 flying bombs demonstrated several important technical principles that would influence warfare for decades. First, it proved that miniaturized electronics could be made sufficiently rugged to survive combat conditions. The vacuum tubes, batteries, and circuits inside a proximity-fuzed shell endured forces that would destroy most electronic equipment, yet they functioned reliably every time. This achievement laid groundwork for all future military electronics. Second, it validated the concept of autonomous weapons systems. A proximity-fuzed shell made its own decision about when to detonate based on sensor data, without human intervention. This was a primitive form of automation, but it established the principle that weapons could incorporate decision-making algorithms. Every modern smart weapon, from laser-guided bombs to cruise missiles, descends from this fundamental innovation. Third, it demonstrated the value of interdisciplinary engineering teams combining multiple specialties. The proximity fuse required expertise in radio engineering, mechanical design, chemistry, physics, electronics, and manufacturing. No single discipline could have created it. The Applied Physics Laboratory's success came from assembling experts from different fields and forcing them to collaborate. This model of organized technical cooperation became standard for large-scale defense research programs. Fourth, it proved that seemingly impossible engineering challenges could be solved through systematic effort and adequate resources. In 1940, every expert agreed that proximity fuses were theoretically possible, but practically unachievable. 5 years later, they were being manufactured by the millions and achieving success rates that exceeded predictions. The lesson was clear. Proper investment in research and development could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. The production statistics for proximity fuses during World War II are staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 22 million proximity fuses. At peak production in 1944, the monthly output exceeded 500,000 units. The fuses were manufactured by multiple contractors, including Eastman Kodak, General Electric, Sylvania, and Raytheon. The production effort involved thousands of workers and represented one of the war's major industrial achievements. The cost per unit declined dramatically as production increased and manufacturing improved. Early proximity fuses cost approximately $700 each, in 1942 more expensive than many conventional weapons. By 1944, mass production had reduced the unit cost to approximately $18 per fuse. This price was still higher than time fuses, which cost less than $1 each, but the improved effectiveness more than justified the expense. The campaign's end. The success of August 28, 1944 effectively marked the end of the V-1 campaign as a strategic threat to London. Launch rates declined sharply in September as Allied forces overran most launch sites in France. German forces relocated some launchers to the Netherlands and began air-launching V-2 from modified bomber aircraft. But these methods produced far fewer launches than the ground-based campaign. Between September 1944 and March 1945, when the last V-1 struck England, German forces launched approximately 4,200 additional flying bombs. British defences, now fully equipped with proximity-fuzed ammunition and thoroughly experienced in countering the weapon, maintained destruction rates exceeding 80% throughout this period. The final statistics for the entire V-1 campaign showed that approximately 10,000 flying bombs were launched at England, of which roughly 7,500 crossed the coast, and approximately 2,400 reached London and surrounding areas. The human cost was significant. V-1 attacks killed approximately 6,200 British civilians and seriously injured over 17,000. Property damage included over 24,000 buildings destroyed completely and over 1 million damaged to some degree. Yet the toll was far lower than it would have been without effective defences. German planners had expected V-1 attacks to kill 20,000 civilians per month. Actual casualties never exceeded half that rate, and the average monthly death toll was under 1,000 terrible, but far below German expectations. The proximity fuse's contribution to these defensive successes was decisive. Without proximity fuses, British defences would have continued destroying approximately 40% of incoming V-2 at ammunition consumption rates that were barely sustainable. With proximity fuses, destruction rates exceeded 80%, using 1/40th the ammunition. The difference represented thousands of British lives saved and provided proof that technological innovation could counter apparently unstoppable weapons. The V-1 campaign also provided valuable data for post-war weapons development. American and British engineers studied every aspect of the engagements: optimal fuse sensitivity settings, best tactics for radar fire control, most effective gun deployment patterns, ammunition consumption rates under various conditions. This information fed directly into post-war anti-aircraft system designs and eventually into surface-to-air missile development. The psychological impact of the proximity fuse extended beyond its direct military effects. For British civilians who had endured 5 years of war, the successful defence against V-2 provided tangible evidence that the war was being won, that British and American technology was superior to German weapons, and that the end was approaching. For German military planners, the V-1 campaign's failure, despite initial successes and continued high launch rates, demonstrated that Germany could no longer overcome Allied technical and industrial advantages. The legacy, the proximity fuse, remained, classified at the highest levels until after Germany's surrender in May 1945. Even then, full technical details were not released publicly for several years due to ongoing security concerns about the Soviet Union potentially acquiring the technology. When details finally emerged in the late 1942, the proximity fuse was recognized as one of the war's decisive technical innovations, ranking with radar, code breaking, and nuclear weapons in strategic importance. Post-war analysis confirmed what combat experience had suggested. Proximity fuses improved anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors of 20 to 40, depending on target type and engagement conditions. Against manned aircraft, proximity fuses reduced the ammunition required per kill from approximately 2,500 rounds to approximately 50 to 75 rounds. Against V-1 missiles, the improvement was even more dramatic, from over 2,000 rounds per kill to fewer than 50. This translated directly into lives saved, resources conserved, and defensive effectiveness multiplied. The technology rapidly spread to other applications. By the late 1942, proximity fuses were being incorporated into anti-aircraft missiles, naval ammunition, and ground warfare munitions. Modern proximity-fuzed artillery shells can detonate at optimal height above ground targets, showering defenders with shrapnel before they can take cover. Anti-tank weapons use millimeter-wave radar proximity fuses to detonate shaped charges at precisely the right distance from armor. Surface-to-air missiles employ sophisticated proximity fuses that can discriminate between actual targets and countermeasures. The economic impact was also significant. The improved efficiency of proximity-fuzed ammunition meant fewer guns, fewer crews, and less ammunition were needed to achieve the same defensive effects. This allowed resources to be reallocated to other military needs. In the specific case of defending against V-2, proximity fuses reduced the number of artillery pieces required by approximately 60% while improving destruction rates. The ammunition savings alone, millions of rounds not fired, represented substantial cost reductions. Perhaps the most important legacy was the validation of science-based weapons development. The proximity fuse demonstrated that systematic application of scientific principles, adequate funding, and talented engineering teams could produce revolutionary military capabilities in relatively short timeframes. This lesson shaped post-war American and British defense policy, leading to permanent research establishments like DARPA in the United States and DSTL in Britain. organizations dedicated to ensuring their nations maintained technical superiority through continuous innovation. The men who developed the proximity fuse received little public recognition during their lifetimes. Merle Tuve and his team at the Applied Physics Laboratory continued their work after the war, contributing to radar development and other defense projects. But their wartime achievements remained classified for decades. When Tuve died in 1982, his obituaries mentioned his work on radio propagation and his role in developing radar, but only briefly noted his proximity fuse work even 37 years after the war ended. Aspects of the project remained sensitive. The gunners who fired proximity-fuzed ammunition during the V-1 campaign returned to civilian life with stories they couldn't tell. Most knew only that they had used special ammunition that was far more effective than conventional shells. The technical details remained classified. Many veterans of the V-1 defenses lived their entire post-war lives, never fully understanding the significance of the weapons they had used or the lives they had saved. Conclusion: the weapon that changed warfare. On the morning of August 29, 1944, as gun crews along the English coast tallied the previous day's successes, one statistic stood out above all others: 82% of V-1 flying bombs destroyed. It was a number that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. It was a number achieved through a combination of scientific genius, industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and the courage of men who stood at their guns night after night, facing weapons they couldn't dodge or hide from. The Japanese admirals who had laughed at the idea of proximity fuses never learned how wrong they were. The technology that seemed impossible to German scientists had proven devastatingly effective in combat. The miniature radios that couldn't survive gun firing had functioned perfectly millions of times. The concept that violated the laws of physics had changed the fundamental mathematics of air defense. In the decades after World War II, proximity fuses became ubiquitous in military arsenals worldwide. Every modern military uses variants of the technology in weapons, ranging from artillery shells to surface-to-air missiles. The basic principle, a sensor-fire munition that detonates itself at optimal range, has become so standard that it's easy to forget how revolutionary it seemed in 1940. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story about the power of innovation under pressure. When Britain faced the V-1 onslaught in the summer of 1944, conventional defences were inadequate. What was needed was not incremental improvement, but revolutionary change. That change came from scientists and engineers who refused to accept that the impossible was impossible, from military commanders willing to adopt radical new technologies, and from ordinary soldiers who learned to use weapons that seemed like science fiction. The V-1 flying bombs that terrorized London for 3 months represented a frightening preview of modern warfare. Autonomous weapons requiring no crew, launched in large numbers, difficult to defend against. The proximity fuses that stopped them represented humanity's ability to innovate faster than threats could evolve. That race between offensive and defensive technology continues today, but its modern form was established in the skies over England in 1944. The 3,056 men aboard the battleship Yamato died because Japanese naval planners refused to accept that battleships had become obsolete in an age of carrier aviation. The millions of proximity fuses produced during World War II saved countless lives because Allied planners understood that winning required not just fighting bravely, but innovating constantly. One approach led to futile sacrifice, the other led to victory. In the end, the proximity fuse represented more than just improved ammunition. It represented a philosophy of warfare that emphasized technical superiority, systematic problem-solving, and the ruthless application of scientific principles to military challenges. It was a philosophy that would dominate American and Allied military thinking for the next 80 years. And it all began with a device that experts said couldn't work, fired by gunners who didn't fully understand it, against targets that seemed unstoppable. The gunners understood one thing perfectly. When the new ammunition arrived, V-1 second started falling from the sky in unprecedented numbers. That was all they needed to know. The scientists who made it possible knew more. They had created a weapon that would change warfare forever. History would prove them correct.